I love deck construction.
The process of looking at a selection of cards, puzzling out how they may function together, extrapolating overarching strategies, analyzing and selecting from these combos and strategies, then ultimately seeing how they fare in competition. I find this whole process so rewarding. It's like being a scientist. You discover something with every creation, every alteration, and sometimes you find a breakthrough. If you're looking for a deck construction experience, you probably will be playing a collectible card game. While nearly every collectible card game incorporates deck construction, there are many factors that go into making a deck construction experience great. Of all the games I have played, Legends of Runeterra stands above all others. I'm going to detail what makes Legends of Runeterra the best deck constructor, but also what led me to stop actively playing it. My focus here will be on Runeterra's deck construction experience, so I'm not going to go into details about other aspects of the game, unless I feel it's needed context. Just so all viewers are on the same page of how you use the decks you'll build, here's a super brief overview of how the game is played. Runeterra follows a similar format to other games based off of Magic the Gathering. You summon units that will attack and defend for you, and gain additional effects by playing spells. Each round, you get more resources to spend on units and spells, and you win the game when you deal 20 unblocked damage to your opponent. One of Runeterra's most notable features, both when looking at general gameplay and deck construction, is champions. Champions are units that can level up, and once they do, they are significantly stronger than other cards. Champions level up when they complete their level up quest. Take Galio for example, who will level up once your units have a total of 25 health. Decks can have up to 6 champion cards, and you almost always will include all 6, which usually means 2 different champions with 3 copies each. Champions leveling up is a cool gameplay mechanic just at surface level, but when discussing deck construction in particular, they provide notable merits.
First, they often add alternative win conditions, or alt-win cons, to decks. Alt-win cons refer to strategies that deviate from the typical way to win the game, so in this case, something that's different than dealing 20 damage to the opponent. Alt-win cons can really add variety and new interesting considerations to make when you're constructing a deck.
Runeterra has a handful of full-featured alt-win cons that completely win the game outside of dealing damage to the opponent. But even outside of those, building towards champion level-ups is reminiscent of building towards alt-win cons. Looking at Galio again, my units having a bunch of health is of course beneficial, but not something I would typically go out of my way to do. If I'm including Galio in my deck, I know it is a big benefit to meet this condition, so I likely make considerations and include card combinations I would never consider in other situations. This is true for most champions, which really adds variety to the deck construction process, making creating every new deck a fresh and new puzzle to solve.
Another large merit of champion level ups, and something that experienced deck construction players may overlook, is they give much needed direction to new players, easing them into the process of constructing a deck. If you tell a novice player that the goal of Runeterra is to deal 20 damage to the opponent, now make a deck, they're going to be completely lost.
Virtually every card can help you towards dealing damage to your opponent in some way. Without direction, every card looks reasonable, and new players can't make informed deck construction decisions. Champion level ups provide direction. They say, hey, do this one, usually straightforward thing, and then you get a superpowered unit. Let's look at Pantheon now. Imagining we are a new player wanting to make a deck with him. We want to target allies over multiple rounds, so the first thing to do is add some cards that target allies. We can just look for cards that target allies and add a bunch of them. Then of course, we need allies to target. Fated is a keyword that benefits from being targeted, so including a bunch of them makes sense. Well, that's 24 cards out of a 40 card deck. We can still add in another champion. Oh, what's this? A champion that recasts spells targeted on him? That will work well with what we're already doing. And this champion's level up wants us to support units, so let's add some units that can do that. And look, that's 39 out of 40. Oh yeah, I saw a giant goat shepherd that looked cool. Let's add him in for good measure. And with that, a new player has created their first deck.
Now of course a new player may be more limited in their card collection, and they'll have to add in a few more giant goats to their deck. But you can see how a single champion's level up condition can be the direction a new player needs, such that they feel like they're creating a deck themselves. And it doesn't really matter how much influence they personally had on the deck, so long as they feel like they're the one who made the deck.
You may be thinking that if decks can be created just by adding a bunch of cards that match your champions, deck construction would be pretty shallow. But I can assure you that if you are wanting to make something competitive, or something that achieves a very specific goal, champion level up conditions can be a source of depth. Still using Pantheon as an example, leveling him up is good, but ideally you want to level them up as quickly as possible. Pantheon wants me to target allies on 5 different rounds. I've experimented with creating a deck that often can level up Pantheon on round 5. The biggest challenge of this concept is targeting an ally on round 1, given that requires an ally in play, then playing something else to target them, with only 1 mana. We can do this with some zero-cost options, but given they are zero-cost, they have some drawbacks. How many of those do we need to include so that we consistently target on round 1? Which of them do we include? Of the ones we choose to include, how do we work around their drawbacks? I've spent many hours tinkering and trying to fine-tune this idea in the past. I did manage to create something that leveled Pantheon reasonably often in round 5, though I never felt it made the drawbacks worthwhile. The cool part though, is through experimenting with this concept, I found other interesting interactions, which did evolve into viable decks. Either way, it should be clear that the same mechanic easing new players into deck construction can be a source of additional depth and consideration for experienced deck constructors. Runeterra's regions are another aspect that is important to look at when assessing its deck construction experience. Similar to most collectible card games, Runeterra's cards are split into multiple regions, each region having its own theme, mechanics, strengths, and weaknesses. Decks in Runeterra can include cards from 2 different regions. In addition to the merits of variety and the ability to read the opponent's options during games, regions do a good job of keeping your options manageable. When I'm making a deck, I want to consider all my options, but with hundreds of available cards, that becomes tedious. Regions means that once I've decided on the core of my deck, I only need to browse through 20% of the card pool to see all my options.
I've heard people raise the concern that being confined to 2 regions is too limiting for deck construction, especially in comparison to games like Magic the Gathering, where you can choose any number of different cards to include in your deck, just at the cost of consistency.
Of course, regions are a limitation, but this limitation is implemented in a way that leads to interesting decisions during deck construction. Yes, sometimes a deck concept just has 2 obvious regions, where the combo or interaction you are building around necessitates cards from those 2 regions. But other times, the core of your deck is based in one region, and you need something that that region doesn't have. Each region in Runeterra is pretty well defined and unique, but for most mechanisms, there will be multiple different regions that employ it, just in different flavors. This means often you not only have to weigh cards against each other, but the regions they come with. For instance, if I'm building a deck around Kale, who grows stronger when I attack with buffed units, having a card that allows for additional attacks seems appealing. Additional attacks in Runeterra are called rallies. Rallies don't exist in Kale's region of Targon, but they are available in Demacia, Noxus, and Bilgewater. If regions weren't limited, I'd probably take this Demacian rally card, as it's the most efficient and least conditional. However, the region limitation makes this a real decision, as whatever rally card I choose comes along with all the other options its region provides, and forgoes cards of any other region. Demacia is great, and it comes alongside a plethora of additional ways to buff units to help Kale. But then looking at Bilgewater, it has this card, Jagged Taskmaster, that can buff a bunch of my cards before they even come into play, something Targon and Demacia cannot do. Possibly, the ability to use Jagged Taskmaster warrants a slightly more clunky rally card.
Both of these routes seem like valid options, which leads to 2 relatively different decks to build, test, and evaluate, even though they both started with the same core of building around Kale.
Additionally, sometimes even a single card gives you multiple options for your regions. Players familiar with the game probably think I'm talking about multi-region cards. And while technically yes, those are cards that can be included in either of their 2 regions, functionally these cards could have just been 2 separate cards reprinted into each of the regions they are a part of. Not particularly noteworthy mechanics-wise, in my opinion. However, look at this card. You probably say that's a Demacian card. You need Demacia in your deck to run that card. But it has a secret, additional region. The Aatrox region. When you add a special type of champion to your deck, called Runeterra champions, they take up a whole region in your deck. Then they give you access to their own region. Aatrox, for example, gives you access to a bunch of different equipment cards that can also be played as powerful, high-cost units. This means that sometimes, even if there is one particular card you are looking to add to your deck, you may still have multiple different regions to choose from to include that card. The game also has options for focusing on just one region, giving players a small advantage for doing so. Some cards have allegiance effects, which only activate if the top card of the deck matches its region. If you choose to run one of these cards, its effect is only consistent if you focus on its own region. I also really want to stress how often cards will have many subtle synergies to explore, in addition to their most popular or obvious ones. Take Riven for example. Each time you get the opportunity to attack, she creates a fragment of a powerful weapon. These fragments can be played on units to grant them a temporary buff, and once you play 3, you get the powerful weapon itself that can be played to give a unit a permanent buff. The advertised synergy when she was released was with Tarek, who both leveled up by seeing you target allies with the fragment, and was able to copy the powerful weapon you create onto an additional unit. But you could also pair Riven with Victor, who gains power and levels up when you play created cards, which all the fragments are. Or you could try and pair her with something that gives additional attacks, as Riven creates a new fragment each time. Not to mention that the buffs are particularly useful on units that can attack multiple times in a round. I found much success with pairing Riven with Lee Sin. Lee Sin levels up once you have played 8 spells, and Riven generating a bunch of them is significantly easier than drawing them. Additionally, Overwhelm, which a fragment and the final weapon provides, is a keyword that has unique synergy with Lee Sin, effectively doubling the damage he does. I'm sure many of these synergies were planned by the developers, but they rarely are in your face, meaning for players it feels like they are discovering them, and they get the joy of that discovery.
Something that should not go unmentioned is Runeterra's balance. Every card feels like it could have a place in some deck.
When I'm crafting decks, in general I want as large a variety of tools as possible without the selection feeling overbearing. Having very few duds that I have to browse through really helps achieve that goal. And balance shows in the decks you see. You usually see a plethora of decks in any given meta. It also means that the meta is often far off from being solved. A particularly memorable example, especially since I had already crafted a similar off-meta deck prior, was the Akshan Sivir deck that took at least a month before people realized its potential. And once people did, it was considered the best deck in the meta, and prompted one of the few times in the game's history in which developers rebalance cards outside of their regular schedule. Something I've seen surprise players of other card games is that balance holds up between rarities. Common cards are just as powerful as rarer cards in the game. Instead, rarity helps shape the new player experience so they can ease into deck construction. The rare cards tend to be more complex cards that can be built around. This means when a new player is just starting out, they won't be bogged down with a bunch of different build-around options. They can just focus on the 1 or 2 that they happen to acquire first, then fill out the rest of the deck with their simpler, but I'll stress, not necessarily weaker, all-purpose common cards.
All the things I've mentioned so far culminate in a deck construction experience that is captivating and filled with a variety and interesting decisions. Having covered most of what makes Runeterra a great deck constructor, I'm going to present my experience with the game.
I started playing shortly after the open beta released. One of the first rare cards I received was the Reckoning, and that formed the core of the first deck I really constructed in the game. The Reckoning wipes out all units with less than 5 power, so long as you have a unit with 5 power. I set out to create a deck where all its units had 5 power. Looking through all the cards, most 5 power cards needed at least 5 mana to play, or had drawbacks. But there was one outlier, Ashe, a 4 mana 5 power unit that had no drawbacks. In fact, she had an upside. And what's this? The upside is lowering the opponent's power? That works perfectly with the Reckoning.
Too perfectly. I felt much too clever finding this synergy that almost certainly was intended. Though in my defense, this was not a popular deck archetype that people were playing, so I thought I found something new.
After adding in things to support Ashe, I had a very unoptimized deck based around the concept. I continued to test the deck, making what alterations I could, and after a couple weeks I had saved up enough resources to craft all the cards I felt should be in the deck, and were still missing. I was still fairly new at the game, but I felt like the deck was decent. It was performing well within whatever rank I was playing in at the time, against people who were copying top decks online.
I was happy with that deck, but I felt like I could create something that fit my playstyle better.
It took only about a week to acquire the resources for that deck. Then I started experimenting with many wilder concepts, with each new deck taking less and less time to create as my card collection grew.
The first expansion released, which brought new cards and possibilities, existing decks to be iterated on, and new decks to be created. I was no longer primarily just playing decks in Runeterra. I was constructing decks and testing my creations.
As more sets released, I found myself constructing around 4 new decks a week, sometimes around new untested concepts, completely different regions and champions than the last. Other times they'd be variations of a concept I'd already tried, possibly subbing in a different support region or trying out newly released cards in an old concept. And notably, very rarely were these decks just common or proven archetypes. The game always felt like there were viable new concepts to explore.
The majority of these decks weren't competitive, but the process of creating and testing these decks was still very enjoyable.
Sometimes though, I would stumble upon something that was competitive, and I would play it in the tournaments that ran every weekend. My friend would sometimes come up with pun deck names, and I would build a deck around it just for fun. For example, Fizz and Chips, which included both Fizz and Chip, both 1-cost units, and a bunch of 1-cost synergy. My all-time favorite creation included a champion who said this when he leveled up.
Tell the people what you have seen today!
I was so excited about the results of all the decks I created, so for anyone who would listen, tell them I did. The game made me enthralled with exploring the thousands of possible deck concepts it had to offer. This game captivated me like no other deck construction game had.
You may be wondering at this point, if I was constructing multiple completely different decks each week, where was I getting the cards? How much money was I spending on this game? I know exactly how much money I spent on Runeterra. $0. Runeterra was built with the intention that you can get all the cards just by playing. And this truly is the primary reason why Runeterra is the best deck constructor.
All the other things I have mentioned prior are real merits of Runeterra, but far from exclusive to it. It's the free access to its card pool that allowed me to really engage with the deck construction like no other game has. With Runeterra, so long as you're enjoying your time, it doesn't matter if what you build becomes nothing. I find other card games push me away from experimenting and trying wild things, because if they end up failing, it will take a lot of time or money to recover the resources I spent on it. With Runeterra, you can build a new deck every single day. Runeterra allowed me to truly play and experiment with everything, with no concern that I'd be investing into something I couldn't get back. A draft mode was removed from Runeterra a couple years after it released. While I enjoyed the draft mode, due to Runeterra's card pool being essentially completely free, it didn't seem as necessary to have compared to other games. The option to boot up a game and build a completely different deck than you were used to was provided by the standard constructed format itself.
Now it turns out that allowing your player base to get the most out of your game without paying for it doesn't pay the bills.
Development shifted to a roguelike deck builder mode, and the new content for the constructed PvP game ceased. First, I should clarify, you can still play the game against people. The servers are still running, and there are still active players. The footage for this video was taken from live games recently. And if you haven't had the joy of experiencing Runeterra, I would highly recommend you try it. If you haven't played the game before, all the content will be new to you, like it once was to me. There are so many other notable positive things that were out of the scope of this video, such as the round structure innately facilitating bluffs, the gorgeous desktop background quality illustrations that exist for every unit in the game, and the Oracle Eye that removes the tedium of complex calculations. You can even start building your collection and learning the game by playing the roguelike mode.
But for me, a lack of new cards does deter me from continuing to play. I'm sure there's effectively endless concepts I haven't tried yet, and the game does try to keep things fresh by having a rotation every several months, but it's not the same as new cards. Which is why I'm starting this series. I plan on looking at multiple different deck construction games, and assessing how well they facilitate a deck construction experience. My budget for these are low, and I need a consistent way of finding new players, so that likely means I'm going to be sticking with digital deck construction games. I have my doubts I'll find anything that compares to Runeterra in its generosity, but who knows, maybe I'll be surprised. If you like deck construction, and you want to share deck construction with others, you should try Sealed Monsters.
Sealed Monsters has been designed to be a roughly 1-hour deck construction board game that's easy to pick up even for players who have never touched a CCG before. Everything needed to play with 4 players is included in one box, and the deck construction happens during play. No one has to prepare anything before the game. You can try the game on Tabletop Simulator now, or in browser on screentop.gg. You can also follow the upcoming Kickstarter campaign and join playtests on the Discord. Links are in the video's description.